Hello all, welcome to another Rook Endgames lesson. This is lesson 11. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the front attack technique, the defensive front attack technique, which is this situation where the rook is placed in front of the pawn. If you remember from previous lessons and also from the rook versus pawn series, normally, I say that the rook should be behind the pawn, either attacking or defending. It's the best way. But there are situations and situations, and as we already know, in the rook and games, the details make the difference. And what are the details over here? Uh, the king is not able to go in front of the pawn, so controlling the promotion of the pawn, which makes to draw far easier. Uh, and the other small detail is the pawn has not crossed the middle of the board yet. So when we place the rook in front, so in this situation in front of the pawn, it's still able to have enough distance to arrest the enemy king. And this is the ideal position. So our king is cut to approach the pawn, but we are able to place the rook in the perfect situation, which is in the more decent place on the front file of the pawn. And here it's white to play. And as we are going to see, it's impossible to make progression as white. Notice that from the defensive perspective, we don't want to allow even a single move from the pawn. So if you allow a move from the pawn, it will change this for a loss, of course. Of course, here it can't progress because I take it with the rook. That's obvious. So let's go with the king. And now we are going to use this technique, the front attacks, to uh, stop the king from helping progressing the pawn. So we check the king goes to the a file. We don't need to check it again. We just need to come back attacking the pawn. So as you can see, the front attack on the pawn, which forces white to protect the pawn. It can protect with the king, but then I check the king again. The king goes to a6, and so I come back and attack the pawn. So always front attack to the pawn. Of course, here white can try to, instead of bringing the king and repeating the position, can try to protect it with the rook, with the rook d4. But because our king is also well positioned, we are going to talk about the ideal position for the king on the front side, which is not the perfect ideal defensive situation. It's the most disadvantageous one. The king now attacks the rook. The rook keeps protecting the pawn from the side, of course, but now it's impossible to progress. I just go with the king. Now I am controlling the advancing of the pawn. If the king comes back to try to help the pawn, well, I simply can check it again. And even if the king seems to attack our rook now, I can keep the king cut away from the pawn, going, for example, to b2 or b1. It was also possible. The idea is now the king is controlling the advancing of the pawn, and white king is the one now cut off from reaching its own pawn, and so it's a draw. We can try to help the advance, but the king just places itself in front of the pawn, and it's just a matter of time of the pawn will be lost, or at least white won't be able to progress anymore because perpetual checks are not enough for a win, of course. So this was when we start with the ideal rook already on c8. Let's now move on to the rook being on h8. It's similar. It's still a draw when white to play. Of course, here the difference is white is able to advance the pawn, so creating a bit more struggle for black, so advancing the pawn. But we have this simple technique from the defensive side. We move the king to e7. There is also other ways, so we can also cut the white king from the rank, cut it from the pawn, and this is also able to draw. When the pawn advances too much, I just bring the rook back, h8, and then move it to c8, and it's impossible to protect the pawn anymore. But this is not exactly the best one for us to memorize over here, although it's still a possible defensive technique that maybe more ahead you are going to appreciate it. Here, the best is to go with the king to e7. So the idea will be to bring our rook and to confront the control of the d file. And it's not possible for white to avoid it. So we are going to be able to reach the front of the pawn, as we are going to see here. The rook can't exchange because this is just a drawn pawn and game, and it's over. It's a draw. Let's see just from the beginning again with the rook on c8. But now let's talk about another important issue on this position from the defensive perspective. So another thing for you to remember is when the pawn is on the fifth rank, so over here, the fourth rank, sorry, from the white's perspective, and black as its king, the king should always be on the fifth or the sixth rank. Okay, always on the fifth or sixth rank. So basically, the two ranks above the pawn. Okay, don't forget this one, because let's say, for example, over here the king makes the mistake. It's black to move and makes the mistake to go to e7. Well, this allows for white to use a technique that normally is a winning one, like in this situation. So we bring the king, the same thing happens, but now, as before on the first example, we can protect from the side, but because the king is not well placed, it can't go to e5 and attack our rook, forcing the rook to go to the side and then maneuvering with the king to being able to control the pawn. And so over here, even if you check it, it's going to happen. The pawn will advance, supported by its own pieces, and black is lost. So don't forget over here, if you have to move, if you don't want to move the rook because the rook is on a proper distance from the pawn, we don't want the pawn to advance in any circumstance, the correct move is to go with the king e5. And now notice what happens. If white tries to support the advance of the pawn, we are going to suffer the frontal attack again, and again the rook attacks the pawn. I can't use the rook like before in the d4 because the king is in a perfect situation to take the rook, of course. Maybe I can try something else like going from behind, but as soon as the rook goes behind, my king can approach, and so from the defensive perspective, I can move the king away. Now the king is cut off from the pawn, and so if I advance, the king just comes in front, and then just a simple maneuver and grabs the pawn. Let's go to the starting position. And finally, after we saw that the king needs to be on the fifth or the sixth rank in relation with the pawn on the fourth, let's see how to explore if the king is on the fourth. So if it was black to move, then simply king e5, it's going to be a draw, as we already know, because every other thing is working. The rook is in the perfect side. But if it's white, white can win. How should we do it? Well, it's very simple. We go to the sixth rank. So we now going to apply cutting the king from a rank. So if the king now approaches attacking the rook, we move to this side. So we always want the rook to be on the file next to the pawn file. Okay, don't forget, we don't want to allow the rook to go farther away because this helps black rook to come and cut the king from being able to go and support the pawn. Okay, so this is the correct move. Now it's black to play again. Of course, black has not many possibilities, so needs to move the rook just one square to the front. But now I can bring my king, even if the king tries. Now notice that two pieces are attacking the pawn. Notice that it was almost lost, but there's always this check, and the king is forced again to move away, and now we can advance the pawn, and the win is going to be easy. I'm going to use the king to support the advancing the pawn, and the rook is already cutting the king away. So we are now in a near Scipione Lucena position. We are going to be able to win. Uh, okay, let's go back just to the beginning. Let's see here the position. Notice that when we started, the king was already in the right position. And of course, we are not going to play king e7 over here because that would be a big blunder. Hope you have enjoyed the technique from the defensive perspective, from the using of the front attacks to stop the pawn from advancing and not allowing the king to help. Remember this important detail of the king being next to the pawn. Notice that, let me show you, I think it was in this position where we advanced the pawn. Notice here, this is not a mistake, okay? Because the pawn is already on the fifth rank. So we need to relate the position of the king also in consideration with the position of the pawn. The pawn is not over here because when the pawn is here and is black to move, okay, these two are possibilities, although this one, it will be the correct right defensive technique. But because the pawn has advanced, we are not going to play a wrong move like this one, because now I am able to explore the advancing of the pawn, and as you can see, I'm going to reach the winning Scipione Lucena position that we already saw on the first lesson. Okay, I won't bother you anymore. Hope you have enjoyed this one. This is all also an important lesson. We are going to progress on the techniques to win from cutting the king away in future lessons. But meanwhile, try to stay with your core technique very well prepared. Okay, see you again in future lessons. Bye bye.